Picture a sepia-toned image from 1887 showing a young woman in Victorian bridal attire, her face bearing what appears to be a gentle smile. The elaborate lace veil, the corseted waist, the bouquet of lilies clasped in gloved hands, all hallmarks of upper-class matrimonial custom in the late 19th century. Beyond the bride, in the darkened doorway behind her left shoulder, partially obscured by shadow yet undeniably present, is a figure that has perplexed many for over a century. This is the Willoughby Bride photograph, and the circumstances surrounding its creation have remained buried in institutional archives and private collections until now. The story that emerges from these scattered documents reveals a convergence of Victorian spiritualism, early photographic technology, and a series of unexplained deaths that followed this seemingly innocent marital portrait. What begins with a wedding photograph will lead us through asylum records, police investigations, and scientific debates about the nature of perception itself. The bride has been smiling for 136 years. Tonight we explore what might have been standing behind her all this time. The Willoughby Bride photograph was reportedly discovered in 1972 among the effects of the shuttered Barnwick Institute for Nervous Disorders in West Yorkshire, England. The institute, which operated from 1867 until its closure in 1968, was known for its controversial treatments of various psychological conditions, particularly those affecting women of reproductive age. The photograph was contained in a patient file labeled Willoughby E., admitted June 1887. Hospital admission records indicate that Elizabeth Willoughby was admitted to Barnwick 3 weeks after her wedding to industrialist James Willoughby, heir to the Willoughby Textile Manufacturing Company. Her diagnosis, as recorded by Dr. Harold Fleming, the Institute's director, was acute hysterical mania precipitated by matrimonial anxiety. This was a common diagnosis for women in the Victorian era, often applied broadly to any behavior deemed inappropriate or excessive. What makes Elizabeth Willoughby's case remarkable is not the diagnosis, but the detailed documentation of her condition and the unusual circumstances that preceded her institutionalization. The photograph itself was taken on May 4, 1887, by Frederic Harrington, a well-regarded portrait photographer whose studio in Bradford catered to wealthy industrial families. Harrington's detailed ledger, preserved in the Bradford Municipal Archives, records the commission from James Willoughby: matrimonial portrait, bride alone, formal pose, 3 prints. The sitting was scheduled for 2:15 in the afternoon, and Harrington noted payment of 12 shillings received, a substantial sum for a single portrait. What Harrington did not record, but what was found in correspondence discovered in 1994, was his profound disturbance upon developing the photographic plates. In a letter to his colleague, optical instrument maker Thomas Worthington, dated May 5, 1887, Harrington wrote, "Upon development of the plates from yesterday's bridal sitting, I observed an anomaly which defies explanation. A distinct figure appears in the doorway, though I can attest with absolute certainty that no person was present in the studio save myself and the young Mrs. Willoughby. I have examined the plate meticulously for flaws or evidence of prior exposure, but can find none. I would attribute it to my own failing eyesight, were it not for my assistant having observed the same phenomenon without prompting." This letter marks the beginning of what would become known in specialized circles as the Willoughby case. Harrington, by all accounts a methodical and scientifically minded practitioner of his craft, was sufficiently troubled by the anomaly that he did not deliver the commissioned portraits to the Willoughby family. Instead, according to his business records, he informed James Willoughby that the sitting had been unsuccessful due to quote-to-quote technical difficulties, and offered to arrange a second sitting at no additional charge. This offer was declined. A notation in Harrington's appointment book, dated May 10, 1887, reads simply, "Willoughby cancellation, bride indisposed." The nature of Elizabeth Willoughby's indisposition emerges from the medical records contained in her Barnwick Institute file. According to the admission documents, Elizabeth began exhibiting severe agitation and delusions approximately 1 week after her wedding day. Her husband reported that she refused to sleep in their marital bedroom, claiming that, quote, someone was standing in the corner watching. She became increasingly distressed, insisting that she was being followed by a figure she could only see from the corner of her eye. By the 3rd week of May, Elizabeth had stopped eating and was found by household staff attempting to cut her wedding dress to pieces with sewing scissors, repeating the phrase, "It came through with me." James Willoughby, concerned for his young wife's well-being and family reputation, consulted with Dr. Fleming, who recommended immediate admission to Barnwick Institute for treatment. The treatment regimen prescribed for Elizabeth Willoughby was consistent with Victorian psychiatric practices: isolation, rest, cold water therapy, and the administration of sedatives, primarily laudanum and chloral hydrate. What distinguishes her case is Dr. Fleming's apparent interest in the specific nature of her delusions. His case notes contain unusually detailed transcriptions of his interviews with Elizabeth, conducted during periods when her sedation was reduced to allow for assessment. On June 12, 1887, he recorded, "Patient maintains that the figure from the photography studio has followed her home. When pressed for description, becomes highly agitated, stating only that it is hollow and wears the face incorrectly. Patient insists the figure was not present in the studio in physical form, but came through the lens when the photograph was taken. When questioned about the identity of this figure, patient becomes incoherent, referring to the breathing of the other side." Of particular interest is the patient's insistence that the figure is somehow connected to her husband's factory, specifically the new mechanical looms installed in March of this year. This reference to the Willoughby textile factory introduces a previously unexplored dimension to the case. Historical records confirm that James Willoughby had indeed modernized his father's factory in early 1887, installing power looms manufactured by the Blackburn Mechanical Works. This modernization was not without incident. Local newspaper archives contain reports of worker unrest following the installation, primarily due to fears of job displacement. More significantly, the Bradford Chronicle reported on March 28, 1887, that a night watchman, Thomas Granger, had been found dead on the factory floor, apparently crushed between 2 of the newly installed looms. The coroner's report classified the death as accidental, concluding that Granger had negligently positioned himself within the machine's operational path while inspecting an oil leak. The matter received little public attention, overshadowed by preparations for the Willoughby-Atherton wedding, which united 2 prominent industrial families and was covered extensively in the society pages. The connection between these events might have remained unexplored were it not for the detailed nature of Elizabeth Willoughby's delusions, as documented by Dr. Fleming. In his notes from June 30, 1887, he recorded, "Patient became unexpectedly lucid today, requesting paper and pencil. She produced a detailed drawing of the figure she claims to see, with particular attention to the hands, which she rendered as disproportionately large and misshapen. When questioned about this feature, patient stated, 'His hands were caught first. That's how they pulled him in.' Patient then became severely agitated, tearing the drawing into pieces and attempting to swallow them, necessitating physical restraint and increased sedation. This drawing, meticulously reassembled by Fleming and preserved in Elizabeth's file, depicts a male figure with a distinctive deformity of the right shoulder, a feature that corresponds with a detail mentioned in the coroner's report on Thomas Granger, who was noted to have an old colliery injury resulting in visible malformation of the right clavicle and scapula. This correspondence might be dismissed as coincidental, or as the product of an unstable mind incorporating details from local gossip about the factory death. However, additional evidence suggests a more complex situation. Among Elizabeth's personal effects inventoried upon her admission to Barnwick was a small leather-bound journal. This journal, which Dr. Fleming initially dismissed as the inconsequential scribblings of a disturbed mind, contains entries dating back to April 1887, before her marriage. The early entries are indeed mundane, documenting wedding preparations and social calls. However, an entry dated May 3rd, the day before her bridal portrait session, contains a passage that takes on disturbing significance in light of subsequent events. Visited James at the factory today to discuss the household accounts. The new machines operate with frightful noise and speed. The workers seem diminished beside them. As James showed me through the main floor, I experienced a most peculiar sensation near the western looms, a sudden cold that penetrated to my bones, and the distinct impression that someone was standing directly behind me. When I turned, there was no one there, yet the sensation of being observed remained. I mention nothing to James, who takes pride in my sensible nature, but I confess the experience has unsettled me considerably. Perhaps it is merely wedding nerves, as Mother suggests. This entry establishes that Elizabeth had experienced unexplained phenomena at the factory before her photographing session, specifically in the vicinity where Thomas Granger had died 6 weeks earlier. More significantly, it contradicts the narrative that her psychological disturbance began after the wedding, suggesting instead that the photography session may have marked an escalation of an already developing situation. This timeline is supported by correspondence between Elizabeth's mother, Catherine Atherton, and her sister, Margaret Atherton Brooks. In a letter dated May 2, 1887, Catherine wrote, "Lizzie seems uncharacteristically withdrawn of late. She has always been such a level-headed girl, which makes her current state of nervous agitation all the more concerning. She starts at small noises and twice yesterday complained of feeling watched." James attributes it to the natural anxieties preceding matrimony, but I wonder if there might be something physically amiss. Dr. Bennett has recommended a tonic for the nerves, but thus far it has had little effect. The convergence of these accounts, Elizabeth's journal, her mother's correspondence, and the photography session that reportedly captured an unexplained figure, suggests a progression of events that defies conventional explanation. Yet to fully understand the Willoughby case, we must examine the broader historical context, particularly the intersection of spiritualism, early photography, and industrial revolution that characterized late Victorian England. The 1880s marked a period of significant tension between scientific rationalism and spiritual belief. The Society for Psychical Research had been founded in Cambridge in 1882, bringing academic rigor to the investigation of paranormal phenomena. Photography, still a relatively new technology, occupied an ambiguous position in this intellectual landscape. The camera's ability to capture images invisible to the naked eye, whether due to limitations of human perception, insufficient light, or rapid movement, lent credence to the idea that it might also capture spiritual entities existing beyond normal perception. This concept had been popularized by spirit photographers such as William H. Mumler in America and Frederic Harrington in England, who claimed to capture images of the deceased appearing alongside living subjects. While many such photographers were exposed as frauds using double exposure techniques, the idea that the camera could serve as a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms retained cultural potency. Frederic Harrington, the photographer of the Willoughby Bride image, was not associated with spiritualist photography. On the contrary, his writings in the Bradford Photographic Society Journal reveal him to be skeptical of such practices, referring to spirit photography as elaborate trickery, exploiting the bereaved. This makes his disturbed reaction to the anomaly in Elizabeth Willoughby's portrait all the more significant. Here was a man predisposed to seek rational explanations, confronted with a phenomenon he could not explain through his technical knowledge. The industrial context of the Willoughby case is equally significant. The textile industry in West Yorkshire was undergoing rapid mechanization, transforming not only production methods but social relations. The introduction of power looms like those installed in the Willoughby factory represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between workers and their labor. Human skill and craftsmanship were increasingly subordinated to mechanical processes, creating what contemporary social critics described as a, quote, hollowing out of traditional work. The death of Thomas Granger, crushed within the machinery he was employed to maintain, serves as a literal manifestation of this metaphorical consumption of human labor by industrial apparatus. When viewed through this lens, Elizabeth Willoughby's description of the figure as hollow and wearing the face incorrectly suggests a profound discomfort with the dehumanizing aspects of industrialization, a discomfort that manifested in apparently supernatural form. The historical record reveals that the Willoughby factory was not without previous incidents, even before Thomas Granger's death. Bradford municipal records contain multiple complaints filed by neighboring businesses between 1884 and 1886 regarding quote, excessive noise and noxious vapors emanating from the facility. More tellingly, there were 3 separate reports of workplace injuries in the 12 months preceding Granger's fatal accident, all involving the older mechanical equipment. The installation of the new power looms from Blackburn Mechanical Works was, according to company correspondence, partially motivated by a desire to improve safety conditions, an irony that would not have been lost on the workers who witnessed Granger's death among the supposedly safer modern machinery. The Blackburn Mechanical Works itself has an intriguing history relevant to the Willoughby case. Founded in 1872 by Edward Blackburn, the company rapidly established itself as a leading manufacturer of industrial textile equipment. However, historical records indicate that the company's early success was shadowed by a tragedy similar to the Granger incident. During testing of their first power loom prototype in 1873, a mechanical engineer named Joseph Mercer was fatally injured when his arm became entangled in the mechanism. According to newspaper accounts from the time, Mercer's death was particularly gruesome, with multiple witnesses reporting that he was drawn into the machine with unnatural speed and force. Following this incident, Edward Blackburn implemented extensive safety modifications to the loom design before commercial production began. These modifications were touted in the company's promotional materials as making their equipment the safest in the industry, a claim that the Granger incident at the Willoughby factory would later call into question. Dr. Fleming's treatment of Elizabeth Willoughby continued throughout the summer of 1887, with little improvement in her condition. His notes from August document her increasing fixation on the photograph, despite never having seen the developed image. On August 17th, he recorded, "Patient insists with remarkable specificity that the figure in the photograph stands precisely 3 feet behind her left shoulder, partially obscured by the doorway. She describes details of its posture and aspect that she could not possibly know, having never viewed the photographic prints. When I inquired how she could be certain of these details, she replied, 'Because he stands in the same place now, watching you write your notes.'" This statement apparently disturbed Fleming sufficiently that he discontinued the interview and doubled the patient's chloral hydrate dosage. What Dr. Fleming omitted from his official case notes, but recorded in his private journal, discovered among his effects after his death and now preserved in the Royal College of Psychiatrists' historical collection, was his own experience following this interview. His entry for August 17th, written in a noticeably less steady hand than his usual meticulous script, states, "I find myself unaccountably disturbed by today's session with E.W. While I naturally dismiss her claims of a spectral presence as manifestations of her disorder, I experienced a most peculiar sensation upon leaving her room, specifically, a pronounced drop in temperature in the corridor outside her door, and the distinct impression that someone had fallen in to step behind me. Upon turning, I found the corridor empty, yet the sensation persisted until I reached the main ward. I attribute this to the power of suggestion following the patient's vivid descriptions, yet must acknowledge the potency of the effect. Have increased my evening brandy to steady the nerves." This private admission of experiencing phenomena similar to those reported by Elizabeth suggests that Dr. Fleming may have had moments of doubt about the purely psychological nature of her condition. However, his professional writings and official case notes maintained a strictly rationalist interpretation, consistent with the medical orthodoxy of the period. This tension between private uncertainty and public scientific certainty characterizes many historical investigations of unexplained phenomena, the conflict between subjective experience and objective explanation that continues to challenge our understanding of such cases. By September 1887, Elizabeth's physical health had begun to deteriorate, a development Fleming attributed to her refusal of food and the physical toll of her frequent agitated episodes. On September 23rd, he noted, Patient's weight has decreased by 18 pounds since admission. Pulse weak and irregular. Have implemented forced feeding protocols and prescribed ferrous carbonate supplements. What Fleming did not record, but what emerges from the nursing staff logs, is that Elizabeth had begun to exhibit unexplained physical symptoms, specifically bruising around her wrists, ankles, and throat that appeared overnight, with no observed self-harm or restraint injuries that might account for them. A night nurse named Agnes Collins documented these injuries on September 25, noting purplish marks encircling both wrists and neck, resembling pressure from hands. Patient claims, "He holds me down at night so I cannot move when he draws closer." Dr. Fleming advised to disregard patient's delusions and apply witch hazel compresses to affected areas. Agnes Collins, who served at Barnwick Institute from 1882 until 1903, provides an additional perspective on Elizabeth Willoughby's case through her personal diary, which was donated to the Bradford Historical Society by her granddaughter in 2001. Unlike Dr. Fleming's clinical detachment, Collins' writings reveal a more personal and empathetic engagement with Elizabeth's suffering. In an entry dated September 26, 1887, she wrote, "I cannot dismiss Mrs. W.'s condition as mere feminine hysteria, as Dr. F. insists we must. The marks upon her body appear too precisely placed and consistent to be self-inflicted, yet I observed no one enter her room during my night watch. More disturbing still is the change in the atmosphere of the room itself, a persistent chill that resists even the addition of extra coal to the grate, and a heaviness to the air that makes breathing laborious. Twice during my observations I distinctly heard a sound like labored breathing coming from the corner near the window, though no one was present. I have requested reassignment to another ward but have been denied. I find myself dreading tonight's shift, in a manner entirely uncharacteristic of my usual professional composure." Collins. Observations were shared by at least 2 other staff members, according to the duty roster and personnel notes. On September 30th, an orderly named William Parker requested transfer to day shift, citing, quote, "disturbed sleep and nervous exhaustion," following his overnight duties in the women's ward. His request was granted. Similarly, a junior nurse, Mary Sutton, resigned from her position on October 2nd, giving no formal reason but confiding to Collins, as recorded in the latter's diary, that she, quote, "could no longer bear the feeling of being watched while attending to Mrs. Willoughby." These personnel changes, occurring in quick succession, suggest that the unusual phenomena reported by Elizabeth were not confined to her perception alone. The most disturbing development in Elizabeth's case occurred on October 4, 1887. According to the night staff report, Elizabeth began screaming at approximately 2:15 a.m., crying out that, "He is coming through completely now." When staff reached her room, they found her pressed against the far wall, pointing toward her bed in extreme terror. Nothing unusual was observed in the room, but Elizabeth could not be calmed. Dr. Fleming was summoned, and upon his arrival administered a substantial dose of laudanum. Before losing consciousness, Elizabeth reportedly grabbed Fleming's arm and said clearly, "You must destroy the photograph. It is a door, and he is nearly through." Fleming noted this as a coherent articulation of her central delusion, and interpreted it as potentially signifying a breakthrough in her condition. What transpired between Elizabeth's sedation and the discovery of her body the following morning remains unclear. The night staff logs record that she was checked hourly throughout the night, and was observed to be sleeping deeply at each interval. The final check occurred at 5 a.m., with the attending nurse noting no change in patient's condition. Yet when the day staff entered her room at 6:30 a.m., Elizabeth Willoughby was dead. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure secondary to nervous exhaustion, but the condition of her body raised questions that were never officially addressed. According to an unofficial memorandum written by Agnes Collins and kept separate from the official hospital records, now preserved in the Bradford Historical Society archive, Elizabeth's body was found in a state that defied simple explanation. The patient was discovered lying precisely in the center of the bed, arms extended perpendicular to the body, legs straight, in a position impossible to assume naturally during sleep. More disturbing was the expression frozen upon her face, the eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling, the mouth stretched in what can only be described as a silent scream. Most inexplicable were the marks on the bedsheet surrounding the body, what appeared to be sooty handprints, far larger than any human hand, radiating outward from the corpse, as though multiple individuals had reached toward her from all directions. When I pointed these markings out to Dr. Fleming, he ordered the sheets removed and burned immediately, and instructed all staff that no mention of these details was to be made in the official report or to the family. The following morning, Elizabeth Willoughby was found dead in her bed at Barnwick Institute. The official cause of death was recorded as heart failure secondary to nervous exhaustion, a common designation that covered a multitude of unexplained deaths. James Willoughby arranged for a private burial at the family plot in Thornfield Cemetery, and no autopsy was performed. Dr. Fleming's final case note, dated October 5, 1887, reads, "The unfortunate Mrs. Willoughby's case exemplifies the dangers of allowing feminine nervous sensitivity to go unchecked. Had intervention occurred earlier, before her delusions became fixed, the outcome might have been more favorable." Of particular interest from a research perspective was the unusual specificity and consistency of her delusional system, centered around the photography session and the supposed figure captured therein. Having now examined the photograph in question, which was located among the patient's husband's papers, I can confirm it shows nothing but ordinary shadows in the doorway behind the subject. I have retained the image for potential use in lectures on the manifestation of visual hallucinations in hysterical patients. This final note contains the first confirmation that Dr. Fleming had obtained and viewed the photograph taken by Frederic Harrington. How it came into his possession is unclear, as Harrington's records indicate he never delivered the prints to the Willoughby family. This discrepancy introduces another layer of mystery to the case. If Harrington withheld the photographs due to the disturbing anomaly they contained, how did one print find its way into James Willoughby's possession and subsequently to Dr. Fleming? The most likely explanation emerges from a previously overlooked detail in Harrington's business correspondence. A letter to his photographic supplies vendor dated May 20, 1887, includes a request for replacement glass plates and chemicals to replace those rendered unusable during an unsuccessful client sitting. This suggests that Harrington may have attempted to destroy the original plates containing the anomalous image. However, standard photographic practice of the time involved creating proof prints during development. It is possible that Harrington's assistant, motivated by curiosity or financial opportunity, may have preserved one such proof and provided it to James Willoughby, perhaps to explain the cancellation of the commission, or perhaps for more mercenary reasons. The identity of Harrington's assistant provides another significant connection in the Willoughby case. Bradford Photographic Society records identify him as Robert Collins, the younger brother of Agnes Collins, the Barnwick Institute nurse who documented the unusual phenomena surrounding Elizabeth's death. This family connection raises the possibility that information about the photograph and its disturbing qualities may have flowed between the photography studio and the asylum through this sibling relationship. Robert Collins left Harrington's employment abruptly in late May 1887, according to studio payroll records, and city directories indicate he relocated to London shortly thereafter. No further record of his life or career has been located, creating another loose end in an already tangled narrative. The photograph remained in the Barnwick Institute files until the facility's closure in 1968, when many patient records were scheduled for destruction. The Willoughby file, including the photograph, was preserved only through the intervention of Dr. Margaret Keller, a psychiatric historian documenting Victorian treatment methods, who recognized the unusual level of detail in Fleming's case notes and secured the file for academic research. Dr. Keller's interest in the Willoughby case was initially purely academic, part of her broader research into the gendered nature of Victorian psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. However, her scholarly detachment appears to have eroded over time, as evidenced by her research journals. Her initial notes, dated August 1972, approached the case with clinical objectivity, the Willoughby file represents a textbook example of the pathologization of female emotional response in the Victorian medical context. The patient's legitimate distress at her sudden transition to married life was interpreted as mental illness requiring institutional intervention. The detailed nature of Fleming's notes provides valuable insight into the diagnostic frameworks of the period. By contrast, her entry from November 1972 reveals a marked shift in perspective. I find myself increasingly troubled by certain aspects of the Willoughby case that resist conventional historical medical interpretation. The consistency of the patients, delusions, their correlation with documented events at the textile factory, and the reports of multiple staff members experiencing unusual phenomena suggest dimensions to the case that extend beyond standard psychiatric frameworks. Most disturbing is the photograph itself, which does indeed show what appears to be a figure in the doorway, precisely as Elizabeth described, though she reportedly never saw the developed image. I have arranged for photographic analysis at the university laboratory, though I admit to some trepidation about pursuing this line of inquiry further. The photograph remained in Dr. Keller's private collection until her death in 1998, at which point it was donated to the archives of the paranormal at Edinburgh University. Dr. Keller's decision to bequeath the photograph to this particular institution, rather than a conventional medical archive, suggests her ultimate conclusion about the nature of the case, that it belonged among records of unexplained phenomena rather than simply psychiatric history. Her final published paper on the subject, Beyond Hysteria, Unexplained Elements in the Case of Elizabeth Willoughby, Journal of Medical History, 1997, presents a carefully balanced analysis that acknowledges both the conventional medical interpretation and the aspects of the case that defy such explanation. The paper was met with considerable criticism from her more orthodox colleagues, many of whom considered it a regrettable departure from scholarly rigor. However, it has since become a foundational text in the interdisciplinary field of historical paranormal studies. Modern analysis of the image has yielded intriguing results. Digital enhancement performed in 2003 by Dr. Richard Cormack of the London Institute of Photography revealed details in the shadowed doorway that had been difficult to discern in the original print. The enhanced image shows what appears to be a male figure of indeterminate age, with a distinctly unnatural posture, the torso twisted at an anatomically impossible angle. The face is partially visible, but strangely proportioned, with features that seem, in Dr. Cormack's words, not quite properly aligned, as though assembled by someone with only a theoretical understanding of human physiognomy. Of particular note are the hands, which appear disproportionately large and are positioned in a way that suggests reaching toward the bride. Dr. Cormack's technical analysis, published in the Journal of Photographic Preservation 2004, focuses primarily on the physical and chemical properties of the image rather than its content. His examination confirmed that the photograph was created using standard wet collodion process typical of portrait photography in the 1880s, with no evidence of double exposure, plate manipulation, or other technical interventions that might explain the anomalous figure. Spectroscopic analysis of the image area containing the figure revealed no significant differences in chemical composition from the rest of the photograph, suggesting that the figure was captured during the original exposure rather than added subsequently. In his conclusion, Cormack states, "From a purely technical perspective, the Willoughby Bride photograph presents a genuine anomaly. The figure in the doorway appears to have been captured during the original photographic process, yet demonstrates qualities, particularly in its anatomical configuration, that are difficult to reconcile with a physical human presence. While I hesitate to endorse supernatural explanations, I must acknowledge that conventional photographic science does not provide satisfactory explanations for all aspects of this image." Photographic experts remain divided on whether the figure represents a genuine anomaly or can be explained by conventional means such as long exposure, accidental double exposure, or degradation of the photographic plate. What cannot be easily dismissed is the correlation between the details visible in the enhanced photograph and the specific elements of Elizabeth Willoughby's delusions as recorded by Dr. Fleming, descriptions she provided without ever having seen the developed image. This correlation extends beyond visual details to include her insistence on a connection between the figure and the factory where Thomas Granger died, a connection that finds circumstantial support in the similarity between the deformed shoulder visible in the photograph and Granger's documented injury. The story might have ended with these unresolved questions were it not for a series of subsequent incidents that suggest the Willoughby case had implications beyond a single troubled woman and an unusual photograph. In December 1887, 2 months after Elizabeth's death, Frederic Harrington abruptly closed his photography studio and relocated to Bournemouth on England's south coast. His correspondence from this period, preserved by his daughter, reveals a man increasingly troubled by unexplained phenomena in his studio. In a letter to his brother dated November 30, 1887, he wrote, "I can no longer work in these rooms. The unexplainable cold that pervades the space, the persistent sensation of being observed, and most disturbingly, the appearance of handprints on the inside of the darkroom door each morning, though I am certain of locking it securely each evening. These occurrences have rendered professional work impossible. I find myself unable to enter the darkroom at all, following last week's incident, when the door sealed itself shut with me inside for nearly 3 hours, despite the lock mechanism being on my side of the door. I have disposed of all chemicals and equipment related to the Willoughby sitting and will commence new professional arrangements in Bournemouth after the new year." Further correspondence between Harrington and his brother Samuel, dated January 1888, suggests that the phenomena he experienced were not confined to the studio premises. Writing from his new location in Bournemouth, Harrington confessed, "I had hoped that distance would alleviate the disturbances that drove me from Bradford, but I find this is not entirely the case. While the more dramatic manifestations have indeed ceased, I continue to experience the sensation of being watched, particularly in the small hours of the morning. Twice this week I have awakened to find an inexplicable chill in my bedroom, and the distinct impression that someone is standing at the foot of my bed. Most troubling was last night's occurrence. Upon lighting the lamp, I observed what appeared to be sooty fingerprints on the ceiling directly above where I lay. These marks defied explanation, as they were well beyond reach without a ladder, which I do not possess. I begin to fear that in destroying the photographic materials, I may have inadvertently brought some element of the phenomenon with me. I hesitate to commit my full thoughts to paper, lest you think my mind has become unbalanced, but I increasingly believe that whatever was captured in the Willoughby portrait was not merely a visual anomaly, but something capable of extending its influence beyond the confines of the photograph itself." Harrington's retreat from Bradford coincided with unusual events at the Willoughby textile factory. Factory records from November and December 1887 document an unprecedented series of mechanical failures in the western loom section, the same area where Elizabeth had experienced her peculiar sensation and where Thomas Granger had died. Maintenance logs detail inexplicable stoppage of machines, tools found arranged in patterns overnight despite the premises being locked and guarded, and multiple reports from night shift workers of footsteps and machinery sounds emanating from areas confirmed to be empty and powered down. Most significantly, on December 17, 1887, a second fatal accident occurred when a loom operator named William Collins was found entangled in his machine at the beginning of the morning shift. The coroner's report noted that the injuries were inconsistent with standard machinery accidents, as Collins' body displayed evidence of being forcibly inserted into the mechanism against resistance, rather than accidentally drawn in. Despite these inconsistencies, the death was classified as accidental, and the factory operations continued after a brief closure for safety inspections. The parish register of St. Mary's Church in Bradford contains a curious footnote to the Collins tragedy. The Reverend Thomas Whitaker, who officiated at Collins' funeral, made an unusual notation in the church death register. The deceased bears marks inconsistent with the reported manner of death. Of particular concern are the large handprints, far exceeding human scale, visible on the back and shoulders, as though he had been seized and thrust into the machinery by tremendous force. I have communicated my observations to the authorities, but find little interest in pursuing the matter further. I record them here that the truth may not be entirely lost, should others experience similar fate. This notation was struck through by a later hand, presumably church authorities who considered the comment inappropriate for official records, but remains legible in the original document. James Willoughby, who had maintained regular involvement in factory operations even during his wife's illness and following her death, began to withdraw from day-to-day management in early 1888. His correspondence with the factory manager Samuel Porter suggests increasing unease about the facility. In a letter dated January 8, 1888, he wrote, "I find I cannot bring myself to enter the western section any longer. Please arrange for the accounting office to be relocated to the eastern wing immediately. The constant cold in that area, regardless of boiler output, has aggravated my rheumatism considerably." By February, Willoughby had relocated to London, leaving the Bradford operation under Porter's management, with instructions to provide monthly rather than weekly reports, suggesting a desire for distance from factory affairs. A previously unpublished letter from James Willoughby to his former father-in-law, Richard Atherton, dated March 1888, provides rare insight into his personal response to the events following Elizabeth's death. The letter, discovered among Atherton family papers, contains a passage of particular significance. "I find myself increasingly haunted by the possibility that there may have been more substance to Lizzie's fears than we allowed ourselves to believe. The recent occurrences at the factory, particularly the tragic death of Collins in circumstances so similar to Granger's, have awakened doubts I can no longer entirely suppress. I am pursued by the memory of Lizzie's insistence that something had come through during that cursed photography session, a claim I dismissed as feminine fancy at the time, but which now assumes a more troubling aspect in light of subsequent events. I have engaged a spiritualist recommended by Lady Harwell to conduct a cleansing ritual at the factory, though I have little personal faith in such practices. If nothing else, it may reassure the workers, who have become increasingly reluctant to work night shifts, particularly in the western section. For my own part, I find London's distance from Bradford brings some measure of peace, though I continue to experience disturbing dreams in which I see Lizzie as she appeared in that photograph, with something standing just behind her, reaching forward." In London, James Willoughby established himself in fashionable society, and by 1889 had remarried to Caroline Blackwood, daughter of a shipping magnate. His second marriage appears to have been successful, producing 3 children, and lasting until his death from influenza in 1912. There is no evidence that he ever spoke publicly of Elizabeth, or the events surrounding her breakdown and death. However, his personal diaries, maintained from 1890 until his death, and preserved by his son from his second marriage, contain occasional references that suggest he never entirely escaped the shadow of the Willoughby Bride incident. An entry from October 5, 1897, the 10th anniversary of Elizabeth's death, reads, "Awakened again by the dream, always the same. The photography studio, Lizzie in her wedding dress, and behind her in the doorway, watching not her but me, with eyes that know I can see it. I dare not describe its appearance, even in these private pages. Caroline has suggested a Swiss sanatorium for my nerves, but how can I explain that no treatment will help, when the cause is not within my mind but exists in that cursed image that I burned years ago, yet still sees me? I understand now what Lizzie meant when she said it had come through. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again." The Willoughby factory continued operations under management until 1894, when it was sold to a larger textile conglomerate. The factory building was repurposed multiple times over the subsequent decades, serving as a warehouse, a munitions production facility during World War I, and eventually a commercial laundry before being demolished in 1962 to make way for a housing development. Throughout these various incarnations, the property maintained a reputation for being, in the words of local residents, a cold place, even in summer, and somewhere you didn't linger after dark. Interviews with former employees conducted by the Bradford Oral History Project in the 1980s reveal a consistent pattern of unusual experiences reported across multiple generations of workers at the site. Harold Jenkins, who worked in the building from 1933 to 1951 when it housed the Excelsior Commercial Laundry, recalled, "The western end of the building was always trouble. Machinery would break down for no reason, tools would go missing only to turn up arranged in circles, and there was always that feeling of being watched. The worst was the night shift. More than once, I heard what sounded like one of the old looms running, that distinctive rhythmic clacking, though of course there hadn't been textile machinery in there for decades. The management installed extra lighting in 46 or 47, thinking the problem was poor visibility leading to accidents, but it didn't help. Some areas stayed dark no matter how many bulbs you put in, like the shadows were somehow solid. I left after what I saw in the winter of 51, a figure standing by the old loading bay, with its arms all wrong, too long and bent at impossible angles. When I approached, thinking it was an intruder, it turned to look at me with a face that, well, I won't describe it, except to say it wasn't properly human. I handed in my notice the next morning. Dr. Harold Fleming continued his work at Barnwick Institute until his retirement in 1905. His published case studies and lectures make no specific mention of Elizabeth Willoughby, though several anonymous case references in his 1896 text, Manifestations of Feminine Nervous Disorder, are believed by psychiatric historians to be based on her treatment. Fleming's professional reputation was secure enough that no questions were raised about the high mortality rate among his female patients, a rate significantly exceeding the national average for similar institutions, as documented in Board of Health statistics from the period. After his retirement, Fleming lived quietly in a substantial home near Regent's Park in London, where he devoted himself to collecting medical curiosities and rare books. He died in 1913 of cerebral hemorrhage. An inventory of Fleming's possessions conducted after his death reveals a curious item that may represent his own private acknowledgement of the extraordinary nature of the Willoughby case. Among his effects was a small iron box, sealed with multiple locks, containing a single item, a handwritten note in Fleming's distinctive script that read simply, "What comes through may not go back. Warren Keller." The significance of this cryptic message would not become clear until decades later, when Dr. Margaret Keller began her investigation of the Willoughby case, apparently fulfilling a connection Fleming had somehow anticipated long before her birth. The Willoughby Bride photograph remained in obscurity until 1972, when it was discovered during the cataloging of Barnwick Institute records. Its subsequent journey through private collections and academic archives has been accompanied by reports of unusual phenomena. Dr. Margaret Keller, who possessed the photograph from 1972 until her death in 1998, documented unexplained cold spots in her office where the photograph was kept, and the persistent sensation of being observed while working late. After the photograph was transferred to the Edinburgh University Archives of the Paranormal in 1998, 3 separate archivists requested transfers to different departments following experiences they described as deeply unsettling while working with the Willoughby materials. In 2005, following digital enhancement and analysis of the photograph, a small fire broke out in the laboratory where the work was conducted, destroying some of Dr. Cormack's equipment, but leaving the original photograph undamaged. Dr. Cormack's personal notes, not included in his published analysis but obtained through correspondence with colleagues, describe his own experiences during the analysis process. Throughout the digital enhancement work, I experienced what I can only describe as a profound sense of unease. On 3 occasions, the laboratory temperature dropped precipitously while I was working with the image, sufficiently that my breath was visible and frost formed on the inside of the windows, despite the building's heating system being fully operational. More disturbing were the auditory phenomena. What sounded like labored breathing emanating from unoccupied areas of the laboratory, and on one occasion, a distinct mechanical clicking reminiscent of 19th century looms, as described to me by my grandfather who worked in the Bradford mills. I make note of these subjective experiences with some professional reluctance, as they fall outside the realm of scientific documentation, yet their consistency with historical accounts associated with the photograph seems significant. I cannot escape the impression that the enhancement process, by clarifying the figure in the doorway, has somehow intensified whatever phenomenon the photograph contains or represents. A notable incident associated with the Willoughby case occurred in 2018, when a retrospective exhibition on Victorian photography at the Bradford Industrial Museum included a high-resolution reproduction of the Willoughby Bride photograph. According to museum staff reports, visitors to the exhibition repeatedly complained of cold spots near the display, and the feeling of someone standing directly behind them when near the photograph. The exhibition was closed temporarily for what was officially termed technical maintenance, and the reproduction was removed from display. Museum curator Dr. Jennifer Blackwood provided a carefully worded statement to local press regarding the closure. "We have temporarily removed certain items from the Victorian photography exhibition to address environmental control issues that may affect the preservation of sensitive historical materials." In private correspondence obtained through Freedom of Information requests, however, her communication with the museum's Board of Trustees was more direct. The incidents surrounding the Willoughby Bride reproduction have escalated beyond what can be addressed through conventional museum security protocols. Multiple staff members have refused to enter the exhibition space alone, and we have received 17 visitor complaints describing physical symptoms, including sudden drops in body temperature, difficulty breathing, and the sensation of being touched by unseen hands. I strongly recommend permanent removal of this item from public display and consultation with specialists regarding appropriate containment protocols. The Willoughby case remains an unresolved convergence of historical documentation, photographic evidence, and unexplained phenomena. It connects the personal tragedy of Elizabeth Willoughby to broader historical currents: the mechanization of industry, the development of photography, Victorian approaches to mental illness, and the tension between scientific rationalism and spiritual belief that characterized the late 19th century. Through this complex web of connections, the case raises profound questions about perception, reality, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. What was captured in Frederic Harrington's camera on that May afternoon in 1887? Was it, as Dr. Fleming concluded, merely a shadow, misinterpreted by an unstable mind? Or did the camera lens serve, as Elizabeth claimed, as a door through which something entered from the other side? The evidence, while compelling, remains inconclusive. The figure stands behind the bride, visible yet inexplicable, its nature and purpose unresolved, despite more than a century of investigation. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Willoughby case lies not in its historical details, but in its persistence across time, the way in which the phenomenon, whatever its nature, continues to affect those who encounter it. From Elizabeth Willoughby and the factory workers of the 1880s to museum visitors in 2018, the pattern of experiences remains consistent: the sensation of being watched, localized cold, the impression of a presence just beyond normal perception. This consistency suggests something more than mere suggestion or psychological contagion. It points to the possibility that what was captured in the Willoughby Bride photograph was not simply an image but a nexus, a point of connection between conventional reality and something that exists beyond it, something that continues to reach through that connection into our world. As for Elizabeth Willoughby herself, her brief life and troubling death might have been entirely forgotten, dismissed as merely another case of feminine hysteria in an era that pathologized women's experiences. Instead, her story persists through the photographic image that so disturbed her final months. An image in which she remains eternally youthful, eternally a bride, smiling directly at the camera with no indication of the terror that would soon consume her. Behind that smile lies a mystery that continues to disturb those who encounter it, a mystery that resonates with our deepest fears about what might exist just beyond our perception, waiting to step through when the right door opens. The bride has been smiling for 136 years, and behind her something continues to reach forward, closer with each telling of the story. Some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed again. This has been an exploration of the Willoughby Bride photograph mystery, a tale that weaves together Victorian society, early photography, industrialization, and the unexplained. The story serves as a reminder that history is filled with mysteries that defy conventional explanation and continue to fascinate us with their implications about the nature of reality itself.